Hi, welcome to my channel. This is the third and final video dedicated to the orchestration of the Menuetto of Sonata No. 7 by Ludwig van Beethoven. In the previous video I showed you a simple but effective orchestration for strings that consisted mainly of writing the lower voice in the harmony in octaves between the cellos and the double basses, a traditional model very common in Beethoven's time. In this video I'm going to make some adjustments to that solution, ending with a more advanced and modern version. Now, to show you the different possibilities we have at hand, I'll have to exaggerate a bit. In my opinion, orchestrating excessively is in bad taste, but I'm going to have to. My actual solution would be more modest, but since this is an educational video, I'll go beyond my acceptable limit and produce some sort of orchestration on steroids, so to speak. Also, keep in mind that this will not be the kind of orchestration that Beethoven would have written either. In fact, his solution would have been closer to what I showed you last week, but this is not a video about historical orchestration, so I don't have to stick to the conventions of his time. The first thing I'll do is double the melody one octave lower, by dividing the cellos in half. Cellos are exceptionally loud instruments, so a division will not affect the balance of the ensemble. And furthermore, the melody is the most important element here. I'm also going to ask the double basses to play pizzicato in the first 6 measures, and in order not to diminish the presence of the bass, I'll also split the second violins and make the lower half double the bass 1 octave higher. This will also produce a fuller sound, as you'll notice at the end of this video. At measure 7, the double basses will have an arco indication, as the bass line will become the most important on that measure and the next, so I need all their presence. This theme is a period theme, which means that it consists of 2 phrases, the first of which ends in the dominant. In this type of theme, the phrases, known respectively as antecedent and consequent, tend to be very similar, as is the case here. Therefore, I'll take advantage of this fact and orchestrate the consequent as a kind of response to the antecedent. In fact, in period themes, it is often said that the phrases are in a question-answer relationship, and I will emphasize this by giving the consequent to the second violins, doubled by the violas an octave lower. Next, instead of repeating the first 16 measures using a repeat bar line, I'm going to reorchestrate the entire section in a different way. This will add variety to the solution and break the monotony of a simple repetition. In the first phrase, I'll write the melody in octaves on the first violins. This doesn't pose a threat to balance, as each half will play the same melody, only in a different register, and a characteristic of parts in octaves is that they reinforce each other. At the low end, I'll go back to the traditional approach of doubling the cellos with the double basses. In the consequent, I will do something different. I'll have the melody in 3 octaves, between the upper halves of the violins and the lower half of the violas. The other 3 voices will also be in octaves, in the remaining halves. In fact, all the voices in this phrase will be in octaves, which will make this passage sound fuller, as you'll see. I found a little problem in one of the doublings. Look at what happens here between this doubling of the second voice and the melody in its original register. A minor second appears in the third beat. Actually, this shouldn't be a problem because the dissonance occurs in a weak beat and is resolved in the next. In fact, this is also happening an octave lower, between the lower halves of the second violins and violas. However, the dissonance in that case will go unnoticed, as it occurs between internal parts. The one in the upper register, however, is more exposed and will be noticeable. So I will change a few notes at the beginning and start doubling the second voice a little later in the phrase. Instead of placing a double repeat bar line at measure 32, I'm going to put a single repeat bar line, since I've already repeated the first section. Then in the next passage I'll just add a tiny detail. I'll double the final quarter notes with pizzicati in different groups. I'll start with the first violins, a couple octaves up, but that's okay, then move on to violas, and finally the second violins. Note that I have inverted the 6th in measure 39 to stay consistent with the previous doublings, thus creating the idea of a series of responses. Note also that the dynamics of the pizzicati is higher, since the pizzicato technique has a more restricted dynamic range. At measure 41, I'll drop the cellos. I'm doing this to reduce the number of players and make the crescendo at measures 43 and 44 a little more intense. The violas will play voices 3 and 4, and to create a fuller sound, I'm going to double those voices in the lower half of the first violins as double stops. The cellos will rejoin the ensemble at measure 43, and I'll give them the initial dynamic pianissimo to make their entrance less prominent. Finally, I'm going to write the melody in the second violins in octaves, so that the brightness of the high frequencies makes it stand out even more. My goal in the next phrase is also to make it sound fuller than the simple version I showed you last week. To be able to do that, I'll start by doubling the melody an octave lower with half the violas. Since this will weaken the tight B, and since this note is the root in the next measure, I'll double it in unison with half the cellos. After all, the presence of voice 4 is assured thanks to the double basses. To make it more interesting, I'll only use violas for a couple of measures. Then the octave of the melody will move on to the second violins. At measure 54, I'll have another problem. If I keep doubling the melody an octave lower, I'll have a minor second appear between it and voice 2, and in this case, it is not only exposed, but not resolved correctly either. So I'll move that voice 1 octave lower to the top half of the cellos, and temporarily have all the second violins double the melody at measure 54. This is also a good idea at this point, since the dynamic is mezzo forte. Remember that, to follow the proper rules of voice leading, I didn't write a C sharp in the first beat of measure 55? Well, actually I can put it back because violas can play a minor sixth as a double stop. Every voice in this phrase is in octaves, with the exception of voice 3, because doubling it an octave higher will intersect the descending melody, and doing the same an octave lower will make this passage sound too dark for my taste. In the following section, I will only do one thing. I'll double the response of the upper strings an octave higher the first time. Not doing it in the final measures will make the second response sound different, as if it had been made by another group of instruments. And there you go, a more advanced version of the orchestration that I showed you in my previous video. If you want, you can download a PDF file containing both the simple and the advanced versions from the link in the description. Before leaving you with the playback, don't forget to like and subscribe. In my next video I'll present an orchestration of another work by Beethoven, but this time for woodwinds. Until then, take care. Ciao.